Hello, folks. What's up, y'all? It's Shingi, and I'm here to make an announcement about a new channel which I just started, known as Pan African Lectures, which focuses on African history. We're doing a series, an introductory series, Intro to African History series, but we'll also be doing specialized topics going forward, as well as bringing in guests and other experts to talk about their topics. So before I go any further, let me just also say that it was my birthday this weekend, so still kind of geeked from that. It's always good to be celebrated and to celebrate life. The other thing is, for those of you who know me from this channel, I'm Shingima Vima, the poet. Maybe the wannabe rapper, the cultural commentator, but by profession, I'm a history professor. Got my PhD in African American and African Studies from Michigan State University last year, May 2019, and now I teach at the University of Toledo as an assistant professor in the history department, specializing obviously on African history. So I say all this not to brag, but just sort of to situate myself within this conversation. And the reason why I started this channel, Pan African Lectures, was for possibly two or three main reasons, right? The first one being that there's just a gap in African history, if you will. Not a lot of people know African history around the world, and even a lot of us as Africans, even myself, there's a lot of stuff that I learned as a graduate student that I was like, wow, I didn't know this some of these very basic things that I think would be good to know, in the way that I have a good command of European history all the way back to to Julius Caesar, and even beyond that, and other parts of the world. I know about the Incas and the Aztecs in Latin America. So that's something to think about. The second reason is because of COVID. Even my students are having to engage with our material digitally, and so I figured the channel, if nothing else, would work well for them to engage with some of my material. But also now that sort of democratizes that space, and you can engage with that as well. Then finally, lately we've seen an upsurge in protests and sort of righting the historical wrongs that have usually been afflicted on Black communities, on Afro-descendant communities around the world. So I think, and as far as dismantling racist structures that are Eurocentric for the most part, I think an African history channel that doesn't only seek to romanticize but complicates African history, but fundamentally situates African history as part of global history, is as important as anything. And with that in mind, this is particularly relevant to this video, because right after this, I am attaching we are going to go into a clip from one of my presentations, which speaks on, it's an introductory video, which speaks on why the Afrocentric idea is a good one for everybody to engage with, right? And I'll explain why. It's a shortened video. It's an intro to that intro video, right? Now the full video, I will put a link to the full video. I'll put in the description below, as well as a link to the Pan African Lectures channel that I'm asking you guys to follow if this is something you'd be interested in. The particular clip you will see is I recorded it recently, of course, as part of the dozen videos that I've uploaded to this channel since I started it. But the presentation itself goes back a few years, where we used it for the My Brother's Keeper program to train our mentors. I've spoken on the same topic in South Africa. At some points, I've partnered with a good friend of mine, Michael Wilson, to present it. And beginning next week, going into August, it'll be used as part of an anti-racism teach-in course that we are offering to K-12 teachers in the Toledo area. So I'm saying this to say it's bona fide. It's pretty good. So you want to check it out? Thank you for joining me, and thank you for subscribing to my new channel, Pan African Lectures. This is me, typically Shingima Vima, but for the purposes of this video, I'm Dr. Shingima Vima. Enjoy this clip on why Afrocentricity. Thank you very much.
Hello, folks. This is Dr. Shingima Vima. And as part of this series where we are talking about African history and different African phenomena, I thought it would be great for us to start with a refresher on an approach that I like to take to the study of African phenomena and African diasporic phenomena, and that is an African-centered approach. Or also defined as an Afrocentric approach. And there may be some nuances to those differences, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll keep it very simple. So we'll talk about what it is and why it is necessary to adopt as we discuss African phenomena. So thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Okay, let's see, I can share the screen. Okay, perfect. So, all right. So this is where we're at. So, like I said, it's the African-centered idea, African-centered worldview, which has also been termed Afrocentricity. So we're talking about the importance of it, right? And we'll talk about where some of these words come from as we proceed. So what is it? So there are several scholars who have defined this, but possibly the most prominent scholar who has written about this in books such as The Afrocentric Idea and others is Dr. Molefi Asante, currently of Temple University, I believe, who defines it as placing African ideals at the center of any analysis that involves African culture and behavior. So placing African ideals at the center of any analysis that involves African culture and behavior. And we'll unpack that as we go. Another prominent scholar is C.T. Keto, whose book Vision and Time is one of my favorites as far as talking about the African-centered worldview. And it describes an African-centered paradigm as providing a framework for the centering of knowledge about Africans at home and abroad on the experience of Africans as subjects of history. As subjects of history, which when we say as subjects of history, why is there emphasis on that? Well, it is in opposition to the notion of Africans as objects of history, to where history happens to Africans. Africans themselves do not have any agency in their history, but they are objects. So they're not subjects, which if you know grammar, right? We have a subject, then we have a verb, then we have an object. I drank the water. I am the subject. Drank is the verb. Water is the object. So what we're trying to do is to move us from being the object of history. The Africans were colonized, right? The Europeans colonized the Africans. This was discovered and, all these things, right? And we are trying to move ourselves away from being the objects of history to being the subjects. So you may be wondering, why is this even necessary? How prevalent is this? A lot of you would have noticed already that this is a trend in how people articulate the welfare of Africans. Some of you, it's been so normalized that you don't notice how prevalent it is. So let's look at some instances of why this matters, why we would even bother with this, right? So here are a few quotes that I've drawn from prominent figures, thinkers, leaders, and the likes in history, and how they've articulated the place of the African and the African descendant in the world. George Hegel, famous German philosopher, and we'll talk more about his significance in a little bit. But it says, the Negro exhibits the natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. For Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Wow. Very degrading, very, it wasn't even as controversial a statement back when he said it, but it is very, really posits Africans as subhuman, as primitive in the very real sense of the word, that they are within the realm of primates, right? The natural man in this completely wild and untamed space. Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. That is insane, of course, if you know about African history. It's such an absurd statement, right? We can talk about, movement right from the beginning. We can talk about movement throughout the millennia. And these are some of the things that we'll talk about in this series. But of course, we can talk about everything. We can talk about the universities of Northern Africa. We can talk about the empires of Western Africa. We can talk about the Nguni migrations and the very nuanced ways in which those societies developed, right? And a lot of things. We can be here all day on that, but I don't want to. But why is this important? Well, George Hegel, for scholars of philosophy, you will know George Hegel, right? George Hegel, we talk about the Hegelian dialectic. We talk about this Hegelian way of thinking. We even talk about, in art history, we talk about the idea of aesthetics, which are the notions of aesthetics that are often referred to are Hegel's ideas on aesthetics. What does that mean? Well, Hegel, in many realms of scholarship, is the person who defines aesthetics. And that means he defines, from a scholarly point of view, what constitutes beautiful. I want you to remember that. He defines what constitutes beautiful. And if this man who decides what constitutes beautiful has this view of Negroes, right, of Africa as a continent and its descendants, what does that mean for Africa and beauty? According to him, according to this revered philosopher scholar, Africa and beauty are incompatible, right? That's how that follows. But maybe that's back in the day. Let's look at something more recent. This is the 1960s. I am apt to suspect this is not in the 60s. This is prior as well. I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to whites. So it's the same sentiment, right? That a lot of people believe that Black inferiority is something that is inherent. Okay, so again, this is a very Eurocentric approach and something that serves an imperial purpose. Okay, so it's an imperial purpose. So, and again, this whole series will ultimately debunk that. So I just want you to, these are prominent thinkers we are talking about, scholars and thinkers. These are the things that they've said. What else has been said? Over here, Thomas Jefferson, one of the old-time great leaders of the greatest nation in the world, right? One of the founding fathers. And he goes, free Blacks were pests in society, as incapable as children of taking care of themselves. And he has never seen an elementary trait of painting or sculpture or poetry among Blacks, and has argued that Blacks' ability to reason was much inferior to whites, while in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. So, Thomas Jefferson, right? Now, in recent times, his slave ownership, his rape of his mistress, and these things have been brought to the front lines. But we cannot pretend that his ideas are still not foundational to the U.S. and by extension, Western society, right? And by extension, given the influence that Western society has had on the rest of the world, they are influential to the rest of the world. But this is his impression of Black people. By the way, you ask yourself how Thomas Jefferson has interacted with Black people. How did he interact with them? As enslaved people, right? So not only were these people kidnapped from their homelands, they've been dispossessed of everything, culture,